What does it take for a woman to become a national familiar face before the world ever learns how fragile that visibility really is? And what happens when the same face people once associated with brightness, glamour, and easy charm becomes attached to a story so dark it changes the way the public remembers everything that came before? Before the accusations, before the headlines turned sinister, before digital violence dragged her name into a conversation far bigger than celebrity, Collien Ulmen-Fernandes was the kind of woman German television knew exactly how to use. Quick, pretty, witty, warm, and instantly watchable. She did not arrive as a tragic figure. She arrived as energy, the kind that makes a camera lean forward. She was born in Hamburg in 1981, the daughter of an Indian father and a Hungarian-German mother, and there was already something restless in the way her early life moved. She did not grow into visibility slowly, she chased it. At 15, she left home and stepped toward the entertainment world early, through modeling, dance training in Hamburg and London, music, and the kind of hustle that never looks glamorous while you are living inside it. But maybe that is the first thing people misunderstand about women like Collien. The polished television version always comes later. First comes motion. First comes ambition. First comes the sharp instinct that standing still is not an option. That matters because Collien was never just discovered. She built herself into recognizability, and recognizability is its own kind of power. By the early 2000s, she had become a fixture in German pop culture, especially through Bravo TV, where she entered the public imagination not as a distant actress wrapped in mystique, but as someone vivid, accessible, and alive to the moment. Then came Viva, more hosting work, more appearances, more proof that she could move through television with the kind of confidence that makes presence look effortless. She was not only a presenter, she was becoming a media personality in the old, potent sense of the word, someone audiences felt they knew because she had learned how to make visibility feel intimate. And that is where stories like this become dangerous. Because once the public starts reading someone as familiar, it stops seeing the machinery underneath the image. It does not see the years of self-construction, the calculation, the performance, the effort of becoming easy enough for mass affection. It just sees the finished effect, the bright woman on screen, the face in entertainment culture, the one who seems made for public life. Collien had that effect. She could host, act, move between glamour and humor, and carry the kind of commercial likability brands love almost as much as television does. The public did not need to work hard to accept her. She slid into visibility in a way that felt natural. But natural is often just hard work with the sweat edited out. So the real beginning of her story is not scandal, it is construction. A young woman becoming a screen presence. A girl who left home early learning how to turn motion into career, charisma into currency, and familiarity into protection. Or maybe not protection. Maybe that is the darker truth. Maybe visibility never protects anyone. Maybe it only delays the moment the world realizes how much of a public life is built on things strangers never really understand. Because what is a television persona, really? Is it a shield, a performance, a survival strategy polished until it looks like ease? With Collien, those questions feel more haunting in hindsight. The woman the audience first met was bright, mobile, camera-ready, and deeply legible in the way entertainment culture rewards. But some stories only become frightening when you look backward and realize the early image was never the whole picture. It was just the version the world found easiest to love. And maybe that is why what came later hit so hard. Because when the public thinks it knows a woman like Collien, it does not expect the darkness to arrive from inside the very machinery of intimacy, identity, and trust itself. The danger of becoming familiar to the public is that people start believing familiarity means safety. That was the next illusion in Collien's story. By the time she had fully settled into German media culture, she no longer looked like a girl fighting to become visible. She looked established. The energy was still there, but it had been refined. She was no longer only the fast, bright young presenter moving through pop television with instinct and speed. She had become something more stable in the public imagination, a woman people recognized, trusted, and thought they understood. And maybe that is the version of a public life that looks most peaceful from the outside, not explosive fame, but steady recognizability, the kind that makes a career feel secure. But secure is one of the most misleading words in celebrity culture. Because once a woman becomes easy to recognize, she also becomes easier to project onto. The public starts filling in the blank spaces for her. It sees confidence and assumes emotional certainty. It sees beauty and assumes ease. It sees a media career, a marriage, a family, and a polished public image, then quietly writes the ending before the story has actually arrived there. Stable, successful, protected, the woman who made it. And what if that picture was never true? That is what makes this chapter so uneasy in hindsight. Collien was not only visible now, she was legible. A host, an actress, a personality, a wife, a mother, all the roles the audience knows how to consume quickly because they come with familiar emotional shortcuts. She looked like someone whose life had settled into place. Not perfect, maybe, but formed, publicly coherent. And that coherence matters because it created the exact kind of image that makes later betrayal feel more brutal. Why? Because the more normal a woman's life appears, the harder it is for people to imagine the darkness that might be growing behind the glass. That is the real tension here. Long before the allegations burst into public view, the conditions for the shock were already being built. Collien's face belonged to television, but television teaches a dangerous lesson. If we see someone often enough, we think we know the truth of them. We think frequency is intimacy. We think access is understanding. We think a public marriage means emotional clarity, when in reality it may only mean two people learning how to perform stability under lights. And Collien was very good at performance, not fake, not hollow, but trained. Trained in public composure. Trained in making ease look natural. Trained in carrying a visible life without letting every private fracture show through. That is not deceit, it is survival. Especially for women in media, where likability becomes labor and grace becomes part of the job description. So maybe the question is not how the darkness stayed hidden. Maybe the question is why people assumed it couldn't exist at all. Because the internet was already changing the rules by then. Identity was no longer something a person could fully control once it entered the digital world. A face could circulate endlessly, a name could be copied, a persona could be hijacked, distorted, split into false versions of itself, while the real person was still trying to live inside it. And for someone like Collien, whose public image had always depended on recognizability, that shift carried a particular threat. What happens when the thing that made you powerful, your visibility, becomes the exact thing that makes you vulnerable? That is where her story begins to darken. Not with a scream, not with one single scandal, but with the slow collapse of a boundary people assume exists until it doesn't. The line between the woman the public thinks it knows and the woman whose life may already be under attack in ways no one can see yet. This section is grounded in Collien's public career arc, her marriage and later separation from Collien Ulmen, and the 2026 reporting around identity theft and alleged deepfake abuse. Then the story stepped into a kind of darkness television was never built to contain. Because fame can survive gossip. It can survive mockery. It can even survive betrayal, as long as betrayal still fits inside the old language of celebrity scandal. But what happens when the attack is no longer only against a woman's reputation? What happens when it is aimed at her identity itself? That is where Collien's story stopped feeling like entertainment and started feeling like something colder, more invasive, and far more terrifyingly modern. The allegations that burst into public view did not sound like ordinary tabloid damage. They sounded like the destruction of boundaries, of trust, of ownership over one's own face, one's own body, one's own image. Suddenly, the woman the public thought it knew through television was no longer simply inside a private crisis. She was at the center of a nightmare that felt designed by the digital age itself. And that is what made it hit so hard, because this was not just about humiliation. It was about replication, about the possibility that a woman's image could be stolen, manipulated, sexualized, and sent back into the world wearing her name, while the real person was left to watch in horror. There is something especially brutal about that kind of violation. It does not only wound a private life, it poisons visibility itself. The very thing that once made someone powerful, recognizability, becomes the instrument through which they are harmed. That is the cruelest reversal in Collien's story. For years, her face had been part of her career. Her presence, her warmth, her ability to be immediately read by a camera and an audience, that was her currency. But now, the familiar image that had built her life seemed capable of turning against her. Or worse, of being used against her by forces far more intimate than the public could comfortably process. And once allegations like that become public, the atmosphere changes instantly. People no longer watch with ordinary curiosity. They watch with shock, with fear, with the unsettling sense that technology has found a new way to brutalize women while still hiding behind the language of fantasy, anonymity, and doubt. That is what made this chapter bigger than one marriage, one breakup, or even one celebrity case. Collien's story stopped belonging only to her and became part of a larger argument about digital sexual violence, deepfakes, consent, and how little protection women often have once abuse enters the online world. The public was no longer just reacting to a personal allegation. It was reacting to the realization that something once treated like a futuristic threat had already become intimate, immediate, and devastatingly real. And maybe that is why the emotional tone around her changed so sharply. Before, she had been familiar, legible, entertaining, a woman whose life looked readable enough for television. Now she looked like something else entirely, a warning, not because she chose to become one, but because her story exposed how fragile public identity really is once technology learns how to counterfeit intimacy. It showed that the worst violence is not always loud, physical, or easy to photograph. Sometimes it is synthetic, repeatable, deniable, designed to split a woman from her own image while the world debates whether the damage is even real enough to count. And that may be the darkest turn of all. Not that Collien's life became scandal, but that scandal was no longer a big enough word for what was happening to her. What makes Collien Ulmen-Fernandes' story so difficult to look away from is not just the accusation. It is what the accusation does to the meaning of a face. For years, her image belonged to television, familiar, polished, recognizable in the way mass media likes women to be. She was readable, contained, the kind of public figure people thought they understood because they had seen her often enough to confuse exposure with knowledge. But once a story like this enters the public sphere, that illusion dies quickly. The audience is no longer looking at the same woman it once placed inside entertainment. It is looking at someone whose visibility has become unstable, whose identity itself now feels contested, vulnerable, and under attack. That is why the ending cannot feel triumphant. Too much has changed. Because even if the legal arguments continue, even if the denials remain, even if the headlines one day lose their urgency, something more lasting has already happened. The old relationship between Collien and the public has been broken. She can still be known. She can still be seen. But being seen is no longer innocent. It is no longer simple. The image that once worked as a career has been forced into a different role now: evidence, territory, argument, a site of fear. And maybe that is the real tragedy. Not just that a woman became the center of a dark and modern form of violation, but that the violation itself revealed how little ownership people are truly allowed to have over their own likeness. Once technology learns how to imitate desire, intimacy, and proof, the body no longer has to be physically touched for the violence to feel real. The public no longer has to witness something authentic for the damage to spread. Everything becomes blurrier, easier to deny, easier to circulate, harder to survive. So what remains of a person after that? Not the old image, that is gone. Not untouched innocence, that is gone too. What remains is something far harder and far more unsettling. A woman who can no longer be read through the old language of celebrity, because what happened to her exposed a threat bigger than fame itself. And maybe that is why this story lingers. Because it is not only about Collien Ulmen-Fernandes, it is about the future of public identity and how easily it can be stolen, rewritten, and turned against the person who once depended on it. In the end, she is no longer just a television figure standing inside scandal. She becomes the face of a warning, and warnings stay in the mind longer than entertainment ever does. Background context for this ending comes from Reuters reporting on Collien Ulmen-Fernandes' allegations involving AI-generated pornographic deepfakes, the denial from her ex-husband's lawyer, and the broader public backlash and legal debate in Germany.